KZSU-FM Stanford, welcome to another edition of Hearsay Culture. My name is Dave Levine. I'm a professor at Elon University School of Law, as well as an affiliate scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School, and currently also affiliated with the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at UNC Law, as well as the Information Society Law Center at the University of Milan. Today, I have back on a repeat guest. It's been quite a while since Professor Orly Lobel of the University of San Diego School of Law has been on Hearsay Culture discussing her last book. And today we are discussing a book that has gotten a lot of attention, including one of the Economist 2022 books of note, The Equality Machine: Harnessing Digital Technology for a Brighter, More Inclusive Future. Orly has been, it seems everywhere, discussing this book. I acknowledge that because we are connected on social media, I'm aware of her various visits. I'm grateful for her joining us today because this topic, again, AI, of course, is in many ways the topic du jour, but it's also a topic which in the technology field has been thought about for decades. For decades. It's come to the fore, really, with the advent on November 30th, 2022, Sam Altman's OpenAI and the release of ChatGPT. But as Orly writes about, and as we know, as people in the field for a long time, AI, the concept goes back decades, and the use of AI really goes back at this point, roughly 20 odd years. And you say, well, how is that possible? Well, right, part of it has to do with how we define artificial intelligence, which we'll talk about. But the older phrase for it, and it's still used, is the concept of machine learning, right? The idea that, as Orly writes about in the book, machines themselves do have the capacity to learn. Now, maybe not learn in the human sense, but we'll talk about that as well, but to gather data and inputs in order to give us outputs that, as Orly writes about, have enormous potential benefits to society. Of course, the hard question is how we do this, how we harness it, where the benefits are, and ultimately whether it is worth the risks. And in The Equality Machine, Orly has written an extensive book bringing together a variety of fields, not only data that exists, but even anecdotal information based upon her work and her life, to make the case that, yes, while there are risks, that AI is here, right? And by the way, I should note very quickly, the book came out about a month before ChatGPT was actually made public, which we'll talk about. Of course, there's a little updating we might want to do today, but that. And this is the case that Orly argues for, rather than having fear of the technology or prohibiting the technology, Orly argues that we should experiment with it. We should see what works. We should see presumably what doesn't, right? We can regulate in that space, but that the notion that we should stop it is, in Orly's view, a non-starter. So we're going to be digging in on all of this today on Hearsay Culture. We're recording today on February 13th, 2024. Orly is joining us via Zoom. Thank you so much for coming back on Hearsay Culture.
Thank you, Dave. It's my pleasure to be in a conversation with you. I know that you think about all these issues very deeply, and we always have fun chatting about books and ideas.
That's right, exactly. Well, let's dive right in. As I mentioned, the book came out about a month before, right, ChatGPT was made public, and in many ways the world changed. What inspired you to write this book? What were the antecedents other than, right, the generative AI world that we now exist?
Right. So it's funny, the book that we talked about last time I was on your show was You Don't Own Me, which is my book about Barbie and her history and the Mattel Wars and Bratz. And we say now, like right now, when I'm on a book tour for my new book, The Equality Machine, people joke that like it's the year of AI and the year of Barbie, and I have these two books that kind of anticipated these developments. But exactly as you said, AI has been coming and has been here for much longer than ChatGPT and generative AI. The definitions of AI are diverse, they vary, but really, I think about AI as the whole umbrella of automating processes that humans have previously done. So it can be from the simple kind of decision making based on different factors, and it's like a formula, and you use our computational abilities now to make this formula into an algorithm that replaces the human decision. For example, if you are doing something like sentencing or bail release in government work, if it used to be like, here are the five previous or five like factors, you're doing a simple formula. It can be a simple formula that is now an algorithm that's used in these processes that spits out the recommendation of how long somebody will serve time after they were convicted. There can be, I talk about all kinds of algorithms that are used in health, in decisions about finances. So in all of the spectrum of our lives, but they were here before generative AI. It turns out that government agencies like the IRS have been developing for over 2 decades. You said, past 20 years, but over 2 decades. They've been developing these automated systems to help enforcement, compliance decisions, inspections. And certainly the private industry, and this was a big motivation for the equality machine, has been racing ahead and using algorithmic decision making and using machine learning for many, many processes, both of like production, of course, digital platforms, social media, notoriously have used algorithms to personalize, to know about us, to do marketing, analyze consumer behavior.
Mhm.
But also beyond that, just kind of the processes of organizing work, which is an area that I'm very interested in. I teach employment law, and I look at gender and racial pay gaps, hiring and promotion, biases and discrimination. So, and all, we will kind of unpack as we go a lot of these areas, but in all of these areas, AI has been coming at us. It's around us. It's in us in a lot of ways. There's we wear all these wearables, and I was motivated to write the equality machine to have a much more nuanced, contextual, informed conversation with real facts than what I was seeing in the both kind of popular debates, the media reporting, and even in kind of the more scholarly and policy debates that were informing, what laws we were anticipating for, this newer era. I kind of come at it saying a lot of that conversation is just wrong, and on kind of assessing what the impact of these technologies are, how to direct them. So that was the raison d'etre of the equality machine.
So yeah, you talk in the book early on about the antecedents of the debate, and you point out something interesting. I'd like you to talk about more, which is that aside from the fact that the dominant voices in the space were male, they were also, right, obviously coming out of Silicon Valley, where cyber utopianism, the idea that the internet, right, would make all the world's problems go away. And I'm simplifying a little bit, but I think listeners understand what I mean, right, was dominant. And on the other side, of course, right, you had, generally speaking, with a few exceptions, everyone outside of Silicon Valley, right, this dynamic saying that, big tech is coming to get you. Are those is that earlier debate instructive for understanding the push and pull of figuring out AI today?
Yeah, that's a great question because I certainly see a pendulum when in our conversations about technology, and what you were describing um, was kind of what I saw like till about maybe a year ago, this pendulum of at first a lot of excitement. So like 20 years ago, 10 years, maybe 10 years ago, I would say there was more of this kind of hype where a lot of the public was on board with big tech saying, look at all these problems we can solve, and look at how technology, is going to be so um, powerful that will help us, just kind of tackle all our limits, and everybody will, have access to it. And there was a lot of truth to that, but then there was also like slowly over the past decade, we saw all the problems with tech. We had the Facebook hearings about the prioritizing of problematic content through algorithmic personalization that was creating a lot of harm, and there were a lot more voices from outside of Silicon Valley pointing to how there are problematic ways of automating processes that were just replicating past wrongs, automating inequality, all those, and of course the kind of other part of it is the surveillance part, kind of taking away our privacy, and knowing too much about ourselves, more than we know about ourselves. And my starting point for the book was all of those are correct in some ways, but the reality is that we are here. We're not, like, the train has left the station. The solution will absolutely not be putting the AI genie back in the bottle. That's not how technology works. In fact, it turns out that these fears and fails are something that we always have as kind of anytime there's a technology revolution, there are a lot of fears of introducing those changes, and so part of them are fact-based, part of them are irrational and they're just exaggerated. So I wanted to kind of present this order of, what do we really fear? What should we fear? What are problems that actually can be easily corrected versus problems that are more systemic in this new reality? And to your question of, like, where are we now a year later after ChatGPT was introduced? I think that in some ways, if you remember, our listeners for sure remember just a few months ago, after ChatGPT, like the first versions were introduced, there were actually huge leaps in the fear part. So even more kind of that now that it was like more in our conscious, and more in our kind of surroundings, where everybody was like ChatGPT was the greatest, fastest adopted technology in history. Millions and millions over just a few weeks were adopting ChatGPT and using it. There was also these calls about a moratorium on the technology, the kind of even more of the expressions of fears that I talk about in the book, that we've always had this, I think, fantasy, a lot of it, of the technology rising up against us and becoming like sentient, becoming independent, losing control over it, with large language models. So there've been, again, recently, these, I think, problematic analogies of the technology to the nuclear bomb. So in some ways, there's kind of like, on both measures of the dystopian and utopian, we just the past year, we've seen like a rise on both parts of the debate of, like, large language models are so powerful. They're like, we won't need to work anymore. They'll all, replace us and do all these things, wonderful things. On the other hand, that of course creates all these fears. Well, we'll lose control over them, and we'll also not have jobs, and what will happen, and the distributive justice part of it. So it's kind of on stereo. The whole debate that I was kind of entering to create more orderly, informed discussions, and how do we all enter? I use in the book the term skin in the game, how we can all be from the inside, even when we're a critic. I describe how it's not useful to just kind of be from the outside and say, oh, this is all bad. Well, what do we do about it, as kind of my call, up for constructive engagement, and not have this dichotomy of like Silicon Valley people are creating the systems, and then, other like users are kind of passively harmed and worried about it. But all of it has just accelerated, and so it's an exciting time. This is why, like, I'm continuing to. You and I have a lot to talk about. The audience, I'm sure, is very involved in thinking about all of these questions. So it becomes even more important to have these concrete conversations.
We're chatting with Professor Orly Lobel, author of the book The Equality Machine, on KZSU-FM, Stanford, and Hearsay Culture. I got to ask you, as an author, Orly, would you say, therefore, that you, in retrospect, your book was a year early or right on time? Put it differently, in retrospect, would you rather have had the book out with knowledge, which I assume you didn't have, of ChatGPT? If you did, don't say anything about it because it's probably a trade secret, right? Coming out on November 30th, 2022. Or do you think, you know what, you got ahead of the debate and you're able to have the discussion?
I think the timing was terrific. Again, it came out exactly when ChatGPT came out. I was just recently now on a fireside conversation with the CTO of OpenAI, who's developing ChatGPT. This was a few days before the whole Sam Altman, like, firing and rehiring, and we got to interview each other. He was Jason Kahn was, interviewing me about the book, and had read it, and I was asking him about like the next version that's, coming out, ChatGPT 5, and what is ahead of us on generative AI. And I think that all the principles that I introduce in the Equality Machine about how to think rationally about automation are very much right on point for thinking about generative AI. So again, I'm continuing all these conversations. I just got back from just this week from the Bay Area, Colorado, Atlanta, and Indiana, and we're talking to all these business leaders and academics and researchers about generative AI and AI more generally. And I think, again, these principles of thinking about the comparative advantage of humans versus machines in a contextual way, like how do we actually deploy the technology, rather than kind of thinking about it in the abstract way, is so relevant for large language models and generative AI, where we kind of need to think down the line, not just kind of about the fact that they exist, and we need to think in particular sectors, like what is the potential in the health sector, what is the potential for education and schooling, is the potential for, again, generative AI and other algorithmic decision making in our like marriage markets and love life and sex tech. So I have, as Dave, the Equality Machine has chapters about each of those, and really kind of breaks it down to like, how is work changing, how is hiring and promotion can be upgraded by using AI, how is our like family and care work. So all of these, again, there are a lot of examples of more embodied AI, like even robotics and, robots. And I kind of traveled to Japan. So in the book, actually, you asked about the timing of the book.
But
This kind
let me
of,
jump in
yeah,
for a second
yeah,
on this.
yeah,
I want to before you move to that, because I want to ask you a couple of questions on the points about the
yeah,
book and where it's positioned. So you do note in the book that that you are a consultant, for example, to major platforms seeking to deal with issues involving content moderation and things like that.
yeah.
So how would how do you respond to someone who would say, well, Professor Lobel is part of the industry that benefits from painting AI as positive and worth experimenting with?
Yeah. I mean, that would be a gross overstatement that I'm part of the industry. I consult, and this was relevant to what I was saying about traveling to Japan. So I, as a legal scholar who is an expert on tax policy and have been consulting more governments actually than private industry in a lot of ways. I do a lot of public speaking and some consulting to major players in the industry. And actually, my writing now for a couple of decades, well before I was writing about AI, but I was writing about regulation, is all about how the way that regulation gets done is through private-public collaborations, through understanding industry, through engaging with industry. I am very critical of whether it's just individuals or nonprofit organizations like the ACLU or the Federal Trade Commission, which I have been very much involved with the FTC in all kinds of ways. As you know, I am very much a researcher of labor market competition, non-competes, and I've spoken at the FTC and helped them think about the new rule that they just promulgated. But I'm very critical of bodies and individuals that are not engaged with industry and then just kind of have these statements about what is done without actually examining the facts. So for example, and you mentioned the content moderation piece of this, on content moderation, because we have in our American law, we have the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. We have the basically immunity for platforms on any user generated content. There are no rules and there are no requirements on what private industry needs to do when there is hate speech, false information, misinformation, deep fakes, all of these, problems that are aided by AI, but they haven't been, created by AI. And they've been around, and we care about, just thinking, how do we balance, speech and the need for truth and inclusion and privacy, all these issues, and safety. And so private industry is actually in the work of content moderation with very little guidance from government. And so I think it's crucial for us to acknowledge that they're doing this and that some do it better than others. That a lot of I actually truly believe that most platforms actually want to do a good job in doing some form of moderation. And they're very, again, there's not a lot of guidelines, not a lot of information, and they're struggling with this. So for me, having consulted, for example, Fiverr, which is one of the largest online market platforms for online services, on their content moderation, on their trust and safety, on how to remove hate speech, how to it's just been so fruitful for my research to understand what are the challenges, how do we actually go about it, comparing different platforms in their, efforts to do all of this. So yeah, I think, again, any researcher and any policymaker that is in the space, it would be hubris and just irresponsible to not engage industry.
It's interesting because the content moderation challenge in a lot of ways, right, is, I think, very instructive for how we might think about AI. Um, I can hear listeners, not literally, but I can imagine listeners responding here and saying, yeah, they want to do the right thing, Professor Lobel, but at the end of the day, it's about money, right? And let's put aside X and Elon Musk. We can't really, but let's put it aside because it's such its own universe. But let's take, of course, the progenitor of all of this, Facebook, right? We've seen Facebook use, and this is my area, right? All kinds of trade secrets through algorithms to moderate content in ways that you may, if someone works at Facebook or has access to it, would know, perhaps, but certainly the public doesn't. And yet, right, and yet the constant push towards Facebook and other social media companies to be more transparent, to explain more, has been met with some transparency. There have been reports and so forth, but a lot of pushback from the perspective of, more or less, we know best, right? Or at least leave us to our devices and see what we've done with the internet and how wonderful it's been. And it is true, and this is the question, right? It is true that industry has called for regulation, but have they really? And so I'm curious, having had the experience that you've had, what you would say to someone who would be very skeptical about the notion that the companies really want to do the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that that question is not really a new question. And as
Mhm.
you know, as an expert in trade secrets, that the companies have always used this claim of trade secrecy and proprietary confidential information to conceal all sorts of things that we as the public have the right to know. And so you could, describe the same thing with like pharma and tobacco industry and tackling climate change and environmental, issues. And so it's always that, need to actually define, what really deserves secrecy and what needs to be more transparent, because these are, public issues, and we have, democratic processes on, regulating. So again, as somebody who does regulatory policy, and have been doing it in all sorts of areas of, for example, occupational safety and health and others, I do think that it's kind of always trust and verify with corporate America, with any private industry, that we need to understand that private for-profit organizations have a for-profit goal and mission, and that's fine because that's our society. But that means that there has to be a regulator, an enforcer, an outside, a whole system that governs what is being done. And then so then kind of the next step is like, what is unique about using algorithms for, doing this for-profit, productive, market venture? Is it that new that versus, like, again, like regulating foods and drugs and regulating, environmental safety and things like that? I think that, and again, I show this in the Equality Machine, that actually there's something that is potentially more transparent, like unlike the kind of what we are fed of, this idea of the black box that's so opaque that we can't understand it. So this is kind of the big risk of algorithms. In some ways, like I always say this, that the biggest black box and the most opaque algorithm that we have is like our little tiny brain, which is an algorithm. And actually now that we have digital technology, we have a digital paper trail, we have algorithms that are always changing, but we can kind of have standards. And this is where I very much fall on the side of actually regulating to know more. So I actually think that we need to require companies to keep digital records of, how, for example, algorithms were prioritizing certain content and not others, what content was removed, and getting these reports, sending these reports over to a regulatory agency. And so I mentioned I've been critical of like I have a sister, like a companion article that I published, companion to the book, The Equality Machine, which is called The Law of AI for Good, and it was published last year, where I'm so critical of the Federal Trade Commission for producing this report at the request of Congress. So in 2022, I believe Congress asked the Federal Trade Commission to investigate how to use AI to tackle online harms. So this is all about this problem of like, what do we know about content moderation? And what should Congress, like, if anything, should Congress or the Federal Trade Commission do to require, like more robust content moderation or better content moderation? And this, I think this is just like a great example, like this report that I go through of 80 pages where the FTC basically just says, we don't know because the technology is so rudimentary. We've heard that there's lots of bad things that AI does. There's a lot of bias that it goes into, or, and it cites to, first some, the kind of outdated research. There's actually one commissioner of the FTC that was very also critical of this report. And he says, like, they never went and talked to any like industry players. They were just relying on like the same usual suspects that have been writing against, the, in a critical way against the big tech. And the conclusion after 80 pages is do nothing, Congress.
Right.
So perversely, and this is really important, this is what I come out saying and showing in a lot of the analysis in the various chapters of The Equality Machine. Perversely, people who are just kind of from the outside criticizing and not engaging with where we are right now with technology, they are the most hands-off, like, do nothing. They, like, it ends up not, having any teeth because there's no like real regulation. Like, what are you going to do? I said the train has left the station. So you can kind of, if you're in that stance, you can say, well, let's just ban everything. But that's just such an unrealistic, problematic in and of itself, solution. Like, there have been some of these proposals, like, let's wholesale ban facial recognition technology or emotional recognition technology. And so there's some like states that have, like Illinois has tried to do that. Or another example, let's just ban self-driving autonomous trucks. Like there was an initiative here in California to try to like ban that. That, even if you get that through, it's not sustainable. It's problematic from all sorts of reasons that I show that, because actually the technology can do a lot of good. So facial recognition is a good example. Like, it can be misused, but it actually can create a lot of benefits for health, for, law enforcement and anti-terrorism efforts. And so we have to have a frank, open conversation of like, what are we doing when we're, and not be on these extreme positions. And so again, you can't do any of that without the actual facts of what are companies actually doing? How do we demand more information about it. So that's step one in any regulatory effort that we
And let me interrupt you quickly, Orly, just do a quick station break and just say that you're listening to KZSU-FM Stanford and Hearsay Culture. KZSU is a nonprofit, non-commercial radio station at Stanford University that requires donations from listeners like you to continue its programming. Please email our underwriting department at donate@kzsu.stanford.edu for more information. So, Orly, I interrupted you. I just want to crystallize one point here for a moment, because your book is in fact rife with examples of where the technology can be useful, and you encourage experimentation, as I mentioned in the introduction. However, those whose jobs are on the line might understandably be quite reticent to experiment. In other words, right, a lot of us, and by us I mean academics, are in a fair, although law, as you know, right, is in many ways on the front line of generative AI because of its ability to create content, but put that aside as well. We're in a pretty privileged position, you and I, right, as law professors who more or less will keep our jobs, right, over, the period that we want to continue working in all likelihood, right, regardless of how generative AI and AI more broadly develops. But others are not so fortunate. And so is there a certain amount of debate that kind of takes well, we'll experiment, and there's always people that lose jobs, right, when new technologies come out, which is true. But is that too dismissive? Is it easy for us to say, us being you and I, for example, to say experiment when it's not our job that is the subject of the experiment?
So, okay, so one, I'm not so sure that it's not our job because
Well, it might be.
law professors
Right.
can also be automated in always all kinds of
Fair
ways
enough.
of
Fair enough.
experimentation about, you
But let
know,
me let me be
uh,
even more specific.
yeah,
Okay, you and I, well, I'm assuming you and I are tenured professors, right,
yeah.
at our
No, no,
institution.
no, no.
We're gonna.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm saying this out
No,
loud.
I
You know,
totally understand your question, and I want to respond to it. I was just pointing out that like in every profession, like I teach law students, and I, we train lawyers, and I say actually in my teaching a lot that, and there's been a lot, a lot of thinking on like law tech, that it used to be that the jobs that were automated in previous revolutions were the low skilled, more vulnerable, low wage work that was automated, and like menial jobs, and now it's really all the way to the top. So doctors, like in the Equality Machine, I talk a lot about, and I interview, the developers of these applications that are replacing radiologists and surgeons, and so I absolutely, Dave, think that there is this is a very real thing that is happening and will happen, and we don't even like. And one of the exciting and of course scary things about AI rapid development is that nobody, and no real truly nobody, even like the people that are most in the weeds of the development of large language models, and the deployment of a lot of these technologies, actually they even more so than the rest of us understand how, because how powerful this technology is. It's very hard to like predict exactly how fast and where it's going to in replacing like scientists and programmers and researchers and educators and all these professions. So I absolutely don't want to be understood or heard as saying, that's not important. Like, yeah, I have my tenure job, and so I don't care about it. No, that's like the exactly the opposite of this. I very much care about the labor market, and I care about distributive justice, and I care about equality, and that's why I wanted to write a whole book about equality and our new era. And what is very important to me, however, is again to think about how all of this is a mixed bag of effects. And one of the things that's really important to me to, I think, convince people, I hope like to get people on board when they think about these issues more and kind of read along and the different applications, is to separate between the readiness of the technology. So let's take the example of truck drivers or, like Uber drivers, to separate between our empirical testing of how safe that technology of autonomous vehicles is on the streets and how it can be life-saving. So we don't have to agree if it's now ready, but we can agree that at some near, future point, self-driving cars will be safer than human drivers. It's, I actually think that there's a consensus in that, industry that, and they're already on the streets. Here in California, there are self-operating cars that are approved. You can actually hail a robotaxi from SFO. Self-driving trucks are all over the country, and they are regulated and are approved. So we do have the data to show that they are actually safe on the roads, and they're getting safer. And eventually, we absolutely will be at this moment where they can, reduce accidents very significantly and be safer. And we need to like have the infrastructure for it. We need to invest in all that. So that's one question, and it's a separate question from the question of the displacement of these jobs and the disruption in the job market, which is a very, very important question and something that we need to tackle as a society. But I think that we need to kind of hold those two questions separately and say, like, if we have something that's life-saving as a technology, then we need to deploy it. It would be irresponsible to not allow it, but then we have to look at the consequences to social welfare, to our commitment to everybody to have a dignified life, and have the social contract that we as a democratic society have agreed upon. That's that's a political statement, because maybe not everybody does agree about it. I have actually always come from a social democratic tradition and belief and like worldview, where I think that employment is not the only way, like, so like the one single attachment to one single job as your way to get everything from just basic income, livelihood, skilling, re-education, medical, health, or healthcare, social security, accident compensation, to retirement and pensions, like all of that. I've actually, again, this is something that's not new. I've actually been writing about the fact that it's a historical, like political, pretty arbitrary connection that we've kind of bundled all of those rights to this idea of you start with one job and you retire and you get the gold watch and like your life is set. And well before AI accelerated, we've actually been moving away from that model in terms of like the realities of the job market. People have been in the contingent workplace for a long time. So it's actually, like, again, my politics have been for a long time very clear that the gig economy has been here, and that we need things like the Affordable Care Act that, universalizes access to healthcare in a better way than what we've had in the past, that just just get a full-time job and don't get fired. And so we need much more robust thinking now. And again, I said, it's a political thing. It requires money. It requires much more taxation on big tech and every capital. We need much more to tax capital, much more than kind of relying on taxing labor. Again, I can talk a lot, about all of that.
Well, and that's and no, and we've got about 10 minutes left, and I appreciate you taking on these questions directly. So in the last 10 minutes, then we're going to solve these problems now, Orly.
Right, exactly.
We're going to solve them in 10 minutes. Like I said, the the bulk of the book describes all of these positives, and you've alluded to many of them throughout the book. And of course, the rubber hits the road in the epilogue, right? The last part of the book, where you start talking about, okay, now how do we do it? And so let me ask you a couple of questions on that front, being as we're both lawyers. Sam Altman, again, 2024, right, is obviously calling the shots at OpenAI. And so, and I'm not going to ask the same question I asked earlier. I'm going to ask a question a little bit differently. What is your level of comfort right now? Right now, and again, I emphasize February 13, 2024. What is your level of comfort in the actual real world receptiveness of the AI technology companies, which, as you know, are private, in actually being regulated and honestly working with regulators to come up with regulations that address the risks associated with AI that you allude to in the book?
Yeah. Look, there's always a regulatory pyramid where like there's no alternative to like starting from private ordering and what is happening in the markets. Like, for example, if we take the question of hiring, using AI to help sort and make recommendations on who gets through and gets a job these days. So like that's actually happening. And I think that regulators need to investigate what's being done, what are the best practices, and kind of give, first of all, standardization, like more language on how to sort between, like, the analogy would be like the FDA has been doing that for medical devices and for drugs for a long time, like looking at, testing and all that. So I'm actually getting even more optimistic now. Like when I was writing The Equality Machine, like a couple of years ago, I was seeing like really nothing happening on kind of the regulatory level that was more proactive. Just kind of these calls of like, hey, industry, tackle AI bias, and don't infringe privacy. Just really kind of not useful steps. But now we have the Biden executive order on AI that has a lot of more systemic kind of like ways that so it talks about test beds and sandboxing, kind of having like these controlled environments where you're looking at new technologies that are being introduced and experimenting, and then kind of like offering much more of a public vision. So you said, all these like OpenAI is private, but and I do actually go and talk about like envision the ways that we can have a public option and we can have public standards and like model, rules about, how to deploy technology responsibly. I would push back. I think that in The Equality Machine, it's not just in the epilogue that I do that. Like, I actually think that we need competition. So I think a lot about like why some of these platforms they're like a natural monopoly. They get these dominant positions and the problems around that. And I think that we need to think a lot about how to get new entry and consumer choice so that we have more options. And for example, like again, I have a whole chapter, algorithms of desire, where I talk about like dating apps, and I show like consumers, if they're informed about how algorithms are making decisions about who you see to like offer you a date, or somebody that you might make a love connection with, there are choices that these platforms are making about diversity and inclusion and how much to like how to assess you. And if we have a variety of applications, then we start seeing, and I look at like Tinder versus Match versus Grindr versus, you know, all these other dating apps. There are ways to do things better, like safer, you know, on the safety level, on the, you know, from the aspect of privacy, like health questions, diversity, you know, racial diversity. And I think, you know, again, if we do have a competitive market, if we have government helping tackle the, you know, the riskier aspects of some of these private ventures, and we have consumers that are informed, I think that's the best that we can do. That we, you know, we direct and, you know, harness this technology for good. You know, again, I don't like kind of these abstracts, and this is part of my kind of contrarian and debates that I'm having with some people in the field of like, I don't think we can solve, you know, you said let's solve everything in the next
Right.
5 minutes remaining.
Right.
That's the problem, that we can't solve, you know, the problem of AI, if you want to call it the problem. Like, but I want to emphasize that AI is not a problem. It's a human made, you know, tool that has great potential and also problems. It has, you know, great benefits and also risk. You cannot solve it in some abstract, like one shot, you know, right now. You know, it's constantly a dynamic thing that, you know, we have to remember our commitments, our normative commitments in as a democratic society. We talked about some of that, you know, to fairness, to accuracy, to equality, to you know, freedoms, and in the book I take a lot of time showing that, you know, there's a lot of tensions a lot of times with, you know, these goals, and you can't get everything you want. It's like not some magic wand. What we need to, I think that the best stance that we can take is that we can use this tool, these, you know, kind of really multiple tools, to help, you know, move forward our commitments to the social goals.
So Orly, in closing, right? Very quickly, when you think about the best case scenario, for AI, and I don't do crystal balls here. I'm saying right now, right, based upon the data we have now, what is it for
Yeah.
society?
Yeah. The best case scenario is that the most wicked, toughest problems that we are now facing as a society, as a global society, which is climate and environmental issues, poverty and development, hate, and inequality, you know, safety, and you know, the and health. Each of these, and this is why I remain very, very excited. Each of these, you see these major leaps that have been happening in these sectors, not from like the scientists who are researching biology. So you know, this I actually went and interviewed you know, these people who are involved in machine learning and computer science, to see how like these leaps have been happening with the collaboration of the experts in machine learning and these different sectors. And the great, you know, the best case scenario, the great potential is to democratize these tools and to scale these tools, because, you know, that's the, I talk about this in the context of, for example, radiology, where, you know, I think it's just this real, you know, exciting vision that we can scale a bot radiologist to be so much like, many degrees cheaper than, training another, radiologist, human radiologist, to really provide access to the millions and millions of people who don't have just affordable healthcare. And so that those are the best case scenarios. Again, I think we can only get to that when we have fact-based conversations, informed conversations, balanced conversations that recognize the potential and the harms.
Professor Orly Lobel, author of the book The Equality Machine: Harnessing Digital Technology for a Brighter, More Inclusive Future, published by PublicAffairs. There was my eyesight. Thank you for joining us on the Hearsay Culture Network again. And I know you've got some great projects coming up very, very quickly. I saw recently that your work on Barbie is going to be made into a series. Is that right? Or a series very, very, very quickly. You want to tell us quickly about that?
Well, CBS, yes, is developing it into a mini series. So that's You Don't Own Me, my previous book. And I just want to say to the listeners, so I love hearing from readers. So The Equality Machine and my previous books are all, Kindle, Audible, hard, cover, paperback, and I am very much on all these platforms that we mentioned, including Facebook and X and LinkedIn. And so please connect with me, spread the word, join the conversation, and I look forward to more.
And certainly, Orly, as we move forward with Hearsay Culture Network in 2024, I can anticipate potentially inviting you to have one of those conversations live of sorts with Hearsay Culture listeners. We could talk more about that offline and not putting you on the spot here on the air. Thank you, everyone, for listening to Hearsay Culture today on KZSU. As always, you can check out what is coming in 2024 with the new Hearsay Culture Network, new shows, new hosts. My dear friend and colleague, Denise Howell, joining me with her programs, Uneven Distribution, and our program together, R&D with D&D. But for now, stay tuned to KZSU for more diverse programming. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.
Thank you. Well, that